Hi, welcome to Integrative Preparedness. I am Steve Smith. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between hearsay, training, and experience. Having written a couple of books on the end of the world, Teotwaki, SHTF, EMP, collapse of society, and all that, I should probably tell you, for those of you who maybe not have seen any of the others, the first book is that's not the first book, that's the second book. The first book is the Reversion, okay, and the second book is the Revival, and people keep asking me, when's the renewal coming out? A couple of months, I think. So anyway, having written those books, you can imagine that I talked to a lot of people about preparedness and survival and collapse of society and EMP and collapse of the dollar and earthquakes and hurricanes and anything that could cause a problem. Those people who are interested in preparedness are interested in talking about it. And so I get a chance to talk to a wide variety of people. And I see that there is a wide variety of knowledge would be the wrong word, but there's a wide variety of ideas. There's quite a curve of knowledge and a wide variety of ideas concerning these things. Samuel Clemens, or as most people know him, Mark Twain, said something to the effect, and I won't get this exactly right, but he said, it's not what we don't know that gets us in trouble, it's what we know that we're so sure of, but that we're wrong about. Okay, now I'll disagree with him on the first part, because you can get in a lot of trouble because of what you don't know. But the second part, I'll agree with 100%. Now, I'll tell you just a few stories to illustrate this, and then we'll bring it back to how this applies to preparedness. When I went to DEA school, it was a very interesting experience. Most of us were seasoned officers, a lot of experience there, and so it's good being around a group like that of like-minded folks, and those of you who have had the opportunity to do those kinds of things know what I'm talking about. I had this one class that I didn't care. Nobody really cared about going to. It was a compliance class. It was and nobody cared about learning how to make a case on a doctor for selling diet pills to a soccer mom. But that's what the class was, and we had to go. So we were sitting there, and in comes this guy with a butch haircut. And you have to understand, most of the instructors up to this time had been field guys. They'd been undercover for a long time, and that's just, we were covering the legal aspects of all sorts of things relating to the drug trade. And cool. We were all kind of all on the same level and enjoyed it. This guy came in, and he was totally different. First off, he was out of shape, had a big old stomach on him, even bigger than mine is now. Had a crew cut, wore some loud shirts, and carried this big old nickel-plated Colt government model right there out in plain sight for everybody to see. Now, we all carried guns. Most of us carried more than one. There were enough guns in that room to, take out Venezuela, but nobody showed them. And so it was obvious when this guy came in that he was wanting to show his. It didn't take him long before he started telling war stories. And when the stories, if you have experience, when the stories are true. And this guy was just about as phony as you could imagine. And we thought, what in the world? Where'd this guy come from? Why is he here? Well, we did a little checking, and it turned out that he had been with the Department of Agriculture. And when Jimmy Carter did something or other, doing away or combining some federal agencies. They did away with his job, and but had to find a spot for him in another federal agency at his level. And so they sent him to DEA, which had just recently switched over from the BNDD, which was the old Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. And if there's anybody out there that's old enough to remember that, congratulations if you're still standing up square. But they shipped him over to DEA and of course he wasn't, trained. He didn't have the experience to do much of anything. But so they stuck him in the training cadre and made him a compliance training guy. And so we found out that before coming over there, he'd been a pickle inspector at the Department of Agriculture. Skip forward many, many, many years. And I was teaching martial arts at a gym that I owned. And a guy came in and said he was a black belt, and wanted to know if I had any interest in providing karate classes in my gym. And he came from the system that I had started in when I was young. And I said, well, sure, that sounds like a good idea. And we made an agreement for him to start teaching, and I advertised it. And the day came when it was going to start, and a lot of people showed up. A lot of people paid me their money. And he showed up, and so I hung around and I watched, and it didn't take me but a couple of classes to see that this guy wasn't going to work out. He'd get there late, he'd come with a dirty uniform, he would spend the first 15 minutes talking about his wife, badly about his wife, and then he'd start showing them some stuff that, it wouldn't have worked on the street. It was some classical stuff. It was some of the stuff that you see taught still around, sadly, today. And he was worthless, so I fired him. But I had all these guys that wanted to learn martial arts, so I hired another guy. This guy was a second dan, a second-degree black belt from a different style. And he came and he taught for a little while. And so one day I got to talking with him, and I asked him, I said, do you think you might want to incorporate some techniques that would be applicable on the street in a real situation? And he said, well, these are devastating. These are just deadly techniques. And I said, well, no. Well, anyway, I won't go through the whole story, but it turned out this kid never been in a fight. And he didn't understand, but he was a true believer in what he'd been taught. See? And the problem was he was going to make true believers of some of these other people that he was teaching. So I got rid of him. So there I was with a whole bunch of people that wanted to learn martial arts, and nobody that was worthwhile teaching them. So I started teaching for a little bit, just taught them some street techniques, and until I could find hopefully another instructor for them. Well, I advertised for it, and I got quite a few people coming in. With the one problem was that the ones who wanted to teach weren't worth anything. They had the training. They had all the words. They could talk a great game, but they didn't understand that their techniques and what they were teaching would not work in a real street fight because they'd never been in one. And so the ones who wanted to teach, I didn't feel were capable. They weren't competent. The ones who came in that did, I think, have the ability and probably the skills to teach well. Turned out they didn't want to teach. They just wanted to keep coming to my class to learn what I was teaching these other people. And I wasn't even teaching a system, as it were. I was just teaching them basic how not to get killed and how to come out on top in a fight in the street stuff. And anyway, I got locked into teaching that later on I eventually developed into a system, and blah blah blah. That's not important at this point. And we probably will get into that a little bit in another video. But anyway, pretty soon I started having kids come in, so I've probably gone for several months teaching. One day a young kid came in and asked if I taught grappling. And I said, well, there's some things that, I'll cover that would be considered grappling, but it's not how we start, and it's not. And so he wasn't interested. He just wanted to take grappling. Okay. Pretty soon another kid came in and he asked the same thing. Do you teach grappling? I said, well, again, the same thing. We teach, some things that probably would be considered grappling, but grappling is not our primary, consideration. And well, he went off and just, he didn't want any part of what we were doing. He wanted to grapple. And I thought, I wonder where this has come. Finally, the third guy came in. He says, well, do you teach grappling? And I said, well, again, give him the answer. Yeah, there's some things that later on that we'll talk about things you might consider grappling, but it's not where we start, and it's not what I concentrate on. And I asked him, well, why are you particularly interested in grappling? And he looked at me. This kid's like, 19, 20 years old, wearing a polo shirt with a popped collar and plaid shorts and flip-flops. And he looked at me and he says, well, don't you know that 90% of all fights end up on the ground? And I said, well, where do you get that? He said something or other. And I said, well, it's been my experience that 100% of losers end up on the ground or a car hood, but, you want to stay off the ground if you can, and if you find yourself there, you want to get back up off the ground as quickly as you can. Well, he didn't think that was interesting to him, so he left as well. I wondered what was going on in the martial arts. There seemed to be a lot of people that thought that they knew a lot about it, but didn't have the experience to know that what they were teaching or what they were hearing or what they were talking about just wasn't true. Had no practical application for a guy who's down, trying to keep from having his butt handed to him and go home in one piece. So I kept teaching for a while, and I thought, well, I ended up having a good bunch of banging guys that really wanted to get out there and get it on, and so I said, okay, well, I'll take you around to some karate tournaments here in the area. And I said, I don't know anything about it. I've never fought these types of things. But we'll go and take a look at, see what they're doing, and find out what their rules are, and maybe we'll, enter in some of them after we kind of see what's going on. So I took them to a couple of the local karate tournaments, and I was shocked. I was really shocked at what I saw. It was the biggest bunch of silliness I'd ever seen. Now, later on, I finally met up with the real ass kickers, and I was happy to see that there were still some of those around. But for the most part, what I was running into was just a bunch of people, and I call them pajama dancers, that thought that what they were doing was just extremely deadly. Had built up in their mind how deadly they were, had it built up in their minds by their senseis, their instructors, how deadly they were, and were really masters of repeating garbage that they had heard enough so that they believed it and they could make other people, without the experience to know that it was a bunch of BS, believe it. I got so irritated at that I decided to start a martial arts magazine, which I did. So I went around a major city, Kansas City, the greater Kansas City area, and I started meeting. I just wrote a big list of every martial arts school in town, and I went to every one of them and met the people there, and I was mightily unimpressed with most that I saw. Now, there was a couple that were number one butt kickers, and I'm going to talk about them in a totally separate video, because this has to do with the importance of martial training, and it's very important, but it's just as important to stay away from the bull stuff, because it'll make you think that you have skills that you don't. So anyway, I started this this magazine. And it was never meant. It wasn't a slick magazine. It didn't go into the grocery stores that we say were written for the 12-year-old yellow belts. It ended up going to all the butt kickers around the country and Europe and Canada and some to Australia, I think. But anyway, so I was going around. I walked in a place one time. It was a brand new place. It was Shinwa Taido, which is it's kind of an Aikido type of thing. And I went in to kind of see what it was about. Thought maybe it'll make an interesting article for the magazine, and maybe I'll sell the guy some advertising while I'm there. So I went in there and stood around, and finally the class that was over, and after everybody was gone, a new class was coming in. And the guy came up to me, the sensei, and came up, and I introduced myself, told him why I was there, and of course he was very interested. And invited me to come back another time when we could talk more. So I did. I came back another time, and we had a chance for him to explain to me. And of course, he was trying to sell me on his system, and I understand that. There's nothing wrong with that. And I was trying to sell him an ad. So we were both being very nice to each other. And he told me all about how his particular system was particularly applicable to those people who wanted to be able to defend themselves without hurting other people, which really raised my eyebrow, both of them. Now, this guy's hero was Steven Seagal, which, right? Okay. And I said, well, that's very interesting. And he says, yeah, we also, we're called by a lot of police departments to teach their people how to defend themselves and how to get people to comply with them and how to get them out of cars and stuff like that. And I said, really? Well, why don't you show me some of that? You know, how do you get somebody? I mean, I've had to subdue a fair number of folks, and I never really cared whether I hurt them or not. And usually they got a boo-boo or two. And so, you know, show me this magical way that you can control people without hurting them. So he said, well, okay, we concentrate on pressure points and things like that. He says, for instance, you have a nerve that goes right down in here. He couldn't think of the name of it, but it's the medial nerve. He says, so we will go in there and we will apply pressure to this nerve and we will completely paralyze your arm and your shoulder. And I said, really? Okay. Why don't you show me? So he came up and he put his thumb in there, and he's watching me. He says, you feel that? And I said, well, I feel you pushing on my arm, yeah. And so he dug in there deeper, and he was going at it, and he says, you feel that? And I said, well, I feel you pushing on my arm. He said, well, you have an unusually deep nerve, which is a bunch of junk, you know. And he was trying to save face because he wasn't able to paralyze my arm the way that he'd been assured, probably by his instructor, that he'd be able to. Which brings up an interesting side note if we get to it. So he's digging in there, and he said, well, I don't know, it's just most people it'll work on, but I guess you just have a nerve that, I don't know, you can't get to. And I said, yeah, right. So he says, well, what would you do in a situation, because he was saying that was against a roundhouse punch, right? He wanted me to throw a roundhouse punch. And when you're doing that, you know, you don't want to embarrass a guy in front of his class, and so you throw a big old, you can see it forever, roundhouse punch. Just stick your arm out there so he can make himself look good in front of his class. And so he tried his technique. He deflected or something, or I don't know, tried to get his thumb in there and still didn't work. He said, well, what would you do? I said, well, I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to do anything in front of his. No. He pressured me. Come on, show me what you could do. So I said, well, all right. And I didn't really do what I would do, but when he threw his big old roundhouse punch, I just came across with a hammer block, and I nailed him pretty. You know, I mean, it wasn't that hard, but I nailed him in his forearm, and he just, you'd have thought I'd knocked his arm off. He was like, oh God, ah! You know, and looking at me, and his students were looking at him, and he says, what did you do? And I said, well, I just, I just, it was what we call a hammer block, and I just hit your arm. No, 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 what did you do? He was so certain there was some magic involved in this, and secret knowledge or something, which is big. A lot of people want to believe this stuff, right? That he couldn't make himself believe that a simple block would be effective when he's trying to do all this flippy dippy hippie stuff that he'd been taught by his instructors was the ultimate in self-defense. I see this a lot in preparedness. I see that, that's my buddy texting me again. All right, buddy, when you hear that on this video, you'll laugh again, right? As you're probably already laughing at this video because you've heard these stories before. I've seen this a lot in preparedness. I've heard people tell stories that I knew weren't their own. I've heard them pass on knowledge that I knew they've never tried or implemented themselves. I've heard people of all different levels pass on information that, let me just put it this way, you should test for yourself. Okay? The world is full of people who are more than willing to pass on what they've heard as their own knowledge or their own information, and as a result they have a vested interest in it. They have an emotional attachment to that information because it makes them a part of who and what they are, they think. There are a lot of people with training, and I'm never one to put down training. Training is very important. The more training that you can get, the better. And if training is all you can do, then get it. But I'll tell you the most important thing that training does. Now let me back up for a minute and tell you the most important thing that hearsay does is nothing. Okay? There's a reason that hearsay is not admissible in court, in our legal system, because it can't be verified. It's just something that somebody said. Now, the most important thing that training can do is to prepare you to learn from experience. And experience is the teacher. Now, in our world, it's not easy to get that experience in many cases. If you are able to get experience, whether it's military or police, and I don't mean working in the office or working on the trucks or anything like that. I mean if you're able to get some real on the ground experience, there's nothing that can replace that. Okay? You will see what your training prepared you for and did not prepare you for. But if you can't get that experience, train every bit you can, but use your head. And use your head and get training across a broad spectrum. Don't fall in love with some guru who is going to determine everything that you think and feel about something. Throw a broad net. Get all the information you can and compare it back and forth. See what works. See what makes sense. Okay, and don't form an emotional attachment to something just because somebody says it. Test it. Talk to other people who have been in the situation. Does this work? Does it not work? And then what I would also say is that be responsible for what you pass on. Be responsible for what you do and what you say in regards to how you promote the material that you're passing on, and realize that the person with the most experience usually is the person who's not the most, how shall I say, restricted by one way or another way. Because the more experience you have, the more you realize, and the more you've experienced, then things can go all over the place. They can go in every direction at once. And that there is rarely one way to do anything. Okay. So my suggestion for everybody kind of going on this path of preparedness is to take in all the information you can, test it, understand where the information comes from, but realize that hearsay is worth nothing. Training is worth a lot. But the only thing that training really does is prepares you to first survive, hopefully, and then learn from experience. So let experience be the real teacher. And until you get your own experience, look for those who have actually have the experience. Not just act like they do, but actually have the experience that can lead you in the direction you want to go. So this has been kind of a serious one, I know, but it's one that I talk about quite a bit with some other serious people in the business, and it's something that I think everybody needs to think about a little bit more. So with that, I hope you have a good day. It's windy out there today, but have a good one, and think about your path. Find your training, find your experience if you can. And like we always say, we prepare well today in order to live well tomorrow. Thanks a lot. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.